Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 18, Lord Groth. They covered the body with stones. For a long while the little group stood about it, each one saying his farewell in his own way. Lurin quietly packed Cor's few belongings in a skin shoulder bag to carry away with them. There were some writings, carefully rolled into a scroll, a quantity of dried herbs, a small crude mortar and pestle, a number of small containers, and a few supplies. In silence they made their way back through the long, twisting tunnels. Lund knew the tightness in his chest was shared by the others. To some degree or another they all owed the old man their lives. Berthael's wall map was complete at last. Lund told him as simply as he could what they had found at the end of the last unexplored tunnel. Though he had not known Cor well, Berth was aware of Lund's reliance on the old man's aid. They were alone now, and still trapped in their shelter. Even if they could make use of the drainage pit route, they would have to break out of the running pits and the town of Grail itself. It was easier to sneak through the roaming cages as they had done for the raid. Yet the risk of discovery here was so much greater. The beasts would doubtlessly become agitated with so many people passing through their lair. Groth drew a long column on the wall for the drainage pit. He turned his worried eyes back to Lund.
All we know now is that there is no way out.
Lund tapped his finger on the wall.
One of these tunnels could be extended to take us outside the walls.
Groth slowly shook his head.
It's a chance to take, and I don't know if we could feed all these people for so long.
You mean we will have to face the Torque soldiers?
The ones they used against us so far were mostly beaters. The Torque do not believe we are a threat to them.
If that is so, they will not attack us here where it is difficult to reach. They will wait till we starve.
Groth appeared thoughtful.
Yet the destroyer came down after our raid. If we hurt their pride, they may come after us again.
Lund considered this carefully.
We will need to send spies to the surface. If we know how strong they are, we could let them discover our exit in the roaming pit. That would be the place to trap them.
Zabrin placed his hands behind his head and raised his feet onto a stool. The emptiness inside him had grown to an endless well of painful despondency. So many cycles of care and effort, so many sacrifices made, and now the host of Durallan would march northwards without him. He should have been at Horan's right hand. It was his place of purpose, his destiny, but he had been forgotten, cast aside like a broken tool that no longer had a use. Perhaps when the new realm was shaped and shared out, he would be given a little town somewhere to look after. A stinking hovel filled with stinking peasants, something like Grail. It had all been for nothing. He had to face that stark truth now. What he had worked for was irrevocably lost. There was only revenge. Groth glared at him from across the table, as was his custom these days. The poor thrall had not enough understanding to realize how he had been used for the amusement of his betters. Lord Groth indeed. The mere sound of it was a jest in itself. Even the slaves hiding in the ground were laughing now. It was time for the charade to end. If the fool cast one more lordly look in his direction, he would be sick.
He left you men sufficient for the task?
I have 1,000 here, mostly Southlanders.
Southlanders. And you still think he is not embarrassed with your failures?
Groth remained silent. His frown deepened.
Tell me where he was during the darkening. Did you not think it odd that he never even sent word? All your prepared excuses would not even be listened to. The The priests have all departed. Your temple stands vacant.
Groth set his jaw defiantly.
I will carry out the task entrusted to me.
Zabrin's fingers toyed with an empty cup in front of him.
Naturally you will. That's why it was given to you, along with your empty title.
Groth knew better than to reply to this. Titles were empty if one did not hold it oneself. Zabrin continued.
The citizens of your lordly realm are ready to depart, I take it, without the greater part of their possessions. You cannot tell me you believe they will still call you lord once they reach the new estates in Ligerium or Viron?
Groth clearly did not like the direction in which their conversation was moving. His answer was sullen.
We shall see.
It was obvious that he knew the answer. Zabrin was smiling bemusedly.
You realize, of course, that neither of us is to share in the glories of the northern campaign. Do you even have instructions on where to go after this?
Groth shrugged.
To Nunmerik, I suppose.
You suppose.
Zabrin laughed scornfully.
And what do you suppose you will do there? You will be a lord without an estate, without a commission. You saw to that yourself when you closed down the operations here in the Dankwood. What are you good for now?
There will be other tasks.
Yes, similar to what you did here. That whip you stowed away with such relief. Better take it with you when you head up the road north. I believe there is room for an overseer on the lands of Hekansir.
At last the big tour had enough. He banged his fist on the table and stalked out of the room, leaving a smiling man behind. There was nothing like the cold truth to deflate one's head a little. Lord Groth knew it was a mission without glory he had been asked to perform. Exterminating the slaves would not be boasted about at the victory feasts to come. No one would introduce him as a hero or even a man of valor for completing the task set him. He was not eager for recognition or reward, even if the responsibility here was the greatest ever bestowed on him. Zabrin could say what he wanted. The quality of the chief overseer had been noticed. Orin Inranag himself had called his name and appointed him. As what? Why had the title of Lord been tossed at him like a bone to a dog? It was meaningless, empty. Perhaps it had only been done to humiliate the previous owner. One did not rise from nothing to become a person of importance in the realm of Terrellin. For that, only skill on the field of battle would be of value. And with the slaves holed up beneath the city, there was to be a battle here under his nose. A man who could make his mark as a war leader would impress the Lord of Terrellin. But why had he not sent word? It was as though the whole Grail affair no longer mattered to him. The priests had warned him, that was it. They had informed the master of the situation. There were no more captives awaiting him for the sacrifice, no more potent ringleader. The man he had appointed to take control here had also failed him in the end. Groth sighed. There was but one chance to redeem himself. The slaves had to be crushed in a convincing way as soon as possible. He summoned his captains for a council of war. There were few suggestions that impressed him. Of course his men had to gain a foothold on the ledge in the chimney. A direct assault seemed out of the question. The slaves were prepared for that. There was also the matter of their concealed outlet to the surface. A Southlander spoke up. He compared the slaves to a type of jungle hog that hid in its burrow when cornered. It was very dangerous to go after, and was mostly overcome by smoking it out. Groth listened carefully as others joined in. A number of the empty animal cages could be dismantled and used to build larger ones. These would be filled with firewood and brush, set alight and lowered into the chimney. Men would go down the rope ladders and shove the burning cages onto the ledge with long poles. Bowmen would provide cover, keeping the slaves from interfering. Soldiers could land behind the fires and establish a foothold. They could either wait for the fires to burn out, or keep shoving the cages deeper into the cavern, allowing more men to land. There was even a suggestion to build more cages and lower those down filled with men. The slaves would find it very hard to dislodge a heavy cage like that. There was much for Groth to consider. The slaves were untrained and poorly armed. Among them he knew of but 3 or 4 real fighters. The vast majority would crawl into the deepest hole they could find and hope to remain undiscovered. If their thin front line could be breached, it would all be over. He raised his hands for silence.
We shall build these cages, large enough for 20 men.
He pointed to one of his men.
Set up beams over the edge of the chimney, strong enough to carry the weight. No one is to know what the cages are for. Surprise will be on our side.
He leaned back, already gloating over the victory.
We shall go in 3 days from now, during the night. Strike them while they sleep, when they are worn out by running away from rumors and think themselves safe. Fear makes them easy to overcome.
3 more boys had felt the pull. Lund had sworn Brennick and his troop to silence about the happenings in that far cave. No one would approach him for a blade by their desire alone. They would have to bring proof of an experience with the winged man. And this proof could not be fabricated if no one knew what it was. The boys were older than Brennick, the youngest having 16 cycles, and all 3 of them wore the mark of the branding iron on their arms. They came individually and secretly, with a vision of which blade belonged to them. The moment the lookout sounded the alarm, Lund was awake. He touched 2 or 3 sleeping forms next to him while leaping to his feet. There was a glow outside the mouth of the cave, the red pulsing of fire. Had the destroyer returned, it would not find him unprepared this time. Before he reached the opening, the Vran were already scrambling into position. Spearmen moved to the center, spreading out into a thin line. Brennick herded Luren and the rest of his troop into one of the tunnels, the precious blanket now clutched by Rin. Groups gathered close to the exits, uncertain. The lookout touched his shoulder and pointed upwards. The boy's hand was trembling. Lund peered upwards, careful not to expose himself. 3 square cages, belching flames, were being lowered down to their hideout. Beyond that, men crowded the rim, readying themselves for a descent. Faintly, he could hear the screeching of pulleys as others struggled on the heavy ropes. Ceridwen was at his side. She had lost her usual calm.
I woke from a bad dream. It may go ill for us.
She thrust an object into his hand. His eyes left hers to glance down. It was an amulet, winged crystal, from the hoard they had brought back. She had strung it on a leather thong.
Wear it. I've seen this.
Ceridwen shook her head. There was no way to explain. He gripped her arm before she left.
If we are breached, take them back through the Narrows to the Ronin Cave. Tell Lathan this is my instruction.
She was gone, like a memory of Suntide, warm and golden. Brith's voice reached him from the interior, where he was forming up the spears.
What is it? The beast?
Lund looked up at the cages. There was no sign of the destroyer.
No, they are sending down fire in huge cages. Get the poles!
Quickly, he pulled the stringed amulet over his head. He felt an odd stirring as it touched the skin on his chest, echoed in the blade at his thigh. A great shout sounded from above. Down came the rope ladders. At once he understood their plan. They would use their fire cages as shields to hold back the defenders. The warriors would land behind the barrier and prepare an assault. He glanced at the slippery ledge. When the cages touched it, the grease would burn also, making it easier for the invaders to secure a foothold. There was no way to prevent that from happening. He would have to look to their second line of defense.
Brith, bring the poles forward!
The 40 slaves they possessed might be enough to keep the enemy fires off the ledge. He fervently hoped so. The 350s armed with spears had formed up in ragged formations. Lund hurried back towards them.
We have to keep the cages out of the entrance. If they land, the enemy will be able to follow.
Groth moved forward with the polemen. When he reached the opening, he peered upwards as Lund had done. The first of the enemy arrows whistled down at him. He exclaimed and pulled back, turning his attention to spacing the boys evenly along the open stretch. Lund found Brennick and the other three armed with blades and instructed them to keep close to him. Apart from the 50s of spearmen, there was only a ragtag band of about 30, armed with an assortment of weapons. These he would keep as a reserve. Hundreds of eager, unarmed youths waited in the tunnels. He would not use them unless there was no other option. Deploying these against trained and armored men would only result in a slaughter. He had them put out the fires. With the glow outside, there was more than sufficient light for the Vran to see by. The light of their fires would only make it easier for the enemy to find targets for their bowmen. Lund halted in the middle of the cavern. He tried frantically to think of more preparations to make. Around him in the dark, he could hear the heavy breathing of his youthful host. He could sense the frightened, quick beating of their hearts. These children and young men had only ever cowered under the whip and the snarling of their masters. So few of them had ever taken up a weapon to strike a blow against the oppressor. Yes, they were frightened. They might break before the first assault. If that happened, all would be lost. There had to be something he could do to prevent the catastrophe. Groth was shouting instructions to his pole soldiers. Lund watched as he moved from one to the other, pointing nervously. The silhouettes against the glow outside showed off their small stature. He did not want to lose them or see them hurt. There had been a plan to draw the Torque army into the Ronin pit. Perhaps it was not too late to attempt it. The cages appeared, swinging on their chains, dripping fire into the abyss. Enemy warriors had landed on the ledge opposite and just above the entrance. Long poles with hooks attached were passed down to them, while more men descended on the rope ladders. The ledge was clearly illuminated in the firelight, gleaming wetly with its coating of grease. On both sides of the opening there were sounds of hammering as heavy pins were driven into the rock. A shrill note sounded from a horn. The cages halted their slow descent. Commands were shouted and the poles reached out to catch loose lengths of chain suspended from the cages. Quickly the chains were tied to ropes already passed through pulleys attached to the pins. The men leaned forward, starting a slow oscillation intended to land a heavy object on the ledge. One of the cages was clearly too low. It would not clear the lower edge of the rock. There were shouts and fingers pointed. An adjustment would have to be made. But the other two were on target. With the pendulum swing gradually increasing, it was just a matter of timing it right. Groth watched with growing concern. The Vran poles were only 10 feet in length. They would not reach the cages before they had dropped onto the ledge. Once stationary, these might be too heavy to move. Across the chasm, scores of enemy warriors were descending on makeshift platforms, suspended between stout ropes. They were shouting and brandishing their weapons in anticipation. The cages swung back a final time. Again the horn sounded and the men on the ropes gave a mighty heave, catapulting the massive missiles into the cavern in a huge shower of sparks. All men scrambled and leaped out of the way. The lowest of the three cages touched the ledge, dipping some of its contents onto it. There was a sudden flare as the grease caught fire. The remainder of Groth's group fell back before the surge of heat. A number of them were shoving against the landed cages with little effect. The heat was intense, almost overpowering. Archers on the suspended platforms were loosing arrows blindly into the semi-dark of the interior. One of the miners, a big, muscular youth, was struck in his shoulder. Another moved forward to snatch up the dropped pole, but it was no use. Already 3 more cages had come into view outside, the fuel inside them not lit as yet, but doused with oil and ready. As Groth's few moved the first landed cage forward a foot or two, the swinging had started again. Another arrow hit home. It was easier to see the slaves now that there were blazing fires inside the cavern. Lund ordered them back. Like the men outside, they would have to wait for the fires to burn out. He looked them over, his soldiers, cowering behind rocks to hide from the arrows. Would they hold the charge of the beaters? Behind them were the unarmed thousands, the old women and babies, to be cast into the abyss if they failed. Perhaps it was better to die quickly on the edge of a sword and to starve slowly in these underground vaults. But better still it would be to die under the open sky with the free air to breathe and the starlight overhead. He called Groth to him.
Send people into all the passages. Give the order to retreat to the cavern behind the feeding pit. We will hold them for as long as we can. Let the miners pile loose rocks here where the tunnel widens into the cavern. Take what supplies you can carry with you, but don't sacrifice time for goods. As you can see, they will not allow us to starve in peace. You need to seal off the tunnel properly. Collapse the roof if you can. Keep the people there. I will come for you before the day is out. If I fall, lead them out through the Roning pit and flee for the forest. With so many running, perhaps some will escape.
Groth nodded briefly.
What will you do?
I will lead them in a chase through these tunnels. The long one to the drainage pit is difficult enough. If I can get out that way, I will join you through the feeding pits.
And if you cannot get out?
I will make my stand there. They will have to face me one at a time.
He gripped his friend's hand in farewell.
Go now. There is little time for what you have to do.
Lund watched him hurry off. He hoped fervently that there was enough time to evacuate all the slaves. There would be little room for them in the upper cavern, but at least they would still have access to water. If all went well, they would not remain there for long. Now there were other matters to attend to. He picked out 50 of the unarmed men and assigned them to gather the hoard from the ghost cave. All these priceless objects would have to be returned to that far place and secured there. Lund knew who could be trusted for such a task. It would also give him the excuse he needed for getting the boy out of the fighting.
Brennick,
There was eagerness and anticipation in the child's gaze.
Yes,
which of you or Luren knows the drainage tunnels the better?
Urine would. He did much more work for Core than I did.
Then I have an important task for you. The blades and helms we brought from the ghost cave must be taken back there. The way must be secured again so that these treasures do not fall into the hands of the Torque. Would you and your boys be able to do that?
Brannick nodded, then hesitated.
We will close the tunnel again where we moved the rocks the first time. But I don't want to leave you here.
Lund ruffled his neatly trimmed hair.
I promised you in the forest I would not die without you. Trust the dream you had about those far places. We will walk there together. Hurry now. I have sent people to carry the hoard for you. Make sure Rin stays with you. That way I can know what your situation is.
A quick touch, and the boy was gone. A strange feeling stole over Lund as he watched him depart. It was as though he was saying farewell to them. Ceridwen, Groth, now Brannick was gone. Luren remained with him. He had given the bag with Core's precious items to Kevik. It would be safer hidden away with the rest. Lund turned to him.
Get some rope. We are going up the drainage pit again. Once you have it, set out without me. Prepare the first stage so that we can ascend quickly. I might have to come through there in a hurry.
He was alone among the armed slaves now. 350s of spearmen, 40-odd others armed with anything from clubs to short swords. Where would these 200 Vron go once their lines were breached? A quick thought instructed Groth to hold off collapsing the tunnels till the retreating slave warriors were through. He turned to the assembly and raised his voice.
We hold here as long as we can, but we do not die here. When I signal the retreat, everyone will go up the miner's tunnel and join the others behind the feeding pits. All those not carrying spears will move to the entrance cavern now and hide among the rocks there. As soon as the spearmen come through, you will attack their pursuers and cover the retreat. But do not linger there. Move back into the tunnel as soon as the closest enemies are dead.
Heads nodded round him in the dark. A voice rose up among them.
Where will you go?
I will lead as many as I can down that long tunnel away from you.
There was a pause. Lund could see the glint of light as his spearhead moved. The boy stood up.
May I come with you?
At once there was a clamor of voices asking the same thing. Lund raised his hands.
It will be dangerous. There are places in the tunnel it will take time to cross. The enemy could catch up and trap us there.
There was considerably less enthusiasm now.
I will take 5 with me, no more.
The boy rushed forward and put a hand on his arm.
I need to be one of them.
He said under his breath. The boy's features were vaguely familiar to him. There was a mark of the branding iron on his arm.
Why is that?
The head bowed slightly.
8 seasons ago, you saved my life on the march to the clearings. Allow me to repay the debt.
Lund remembered. A boy who had been badly hurt in Kor's uprising, limping behind him in the line of chained slaves, condemned to die in the farm clearing. He had but 15 cycles, running on the walls of Grail to pick up arrows for the few bows they had, struck 3 times by enemy missiles. It was a miracle he had survived. And here he was, with the mark given those brought back to be hunted by the royalty, yet defiant, waging a hopeless war, retaken, dragged before the Torque Lord. Like all those with the brand, he had lived a charmed life.
What is your name?
Leogarth.
There is no debt to repay me. I will have you with me because you are a proven man.
Slowly, he selected 4 more among those who had raised their hands. He realized he had been wrong. He was not alone, though his friends had gone. These Vran around him were all his family, his friends. Even if he did not know their names, or could not hear their thoughts, the shared suffering had forged a closer tie than blood ever could. Lund had them place a dim light at the exit to the drainage pit tunnel. In the dull red glow of the dying fires, the beaters would be confused, especially when their prey scattered and ran. More of them might aim for the light if that was all that they could make out with their poor vision. Now nothing remained but to wait for the enemy to land behind their fire cages. The first 2 were almost completely burnt out. It would take a while still for the others. He could feel the tension knotting his stomach. The blade was warm in his grip. A barely discernible sound emanated from it, like the singing of harp strings touched by the wind alone. He had need of it now, of its energies and its secrets. It had come from the heart of Myrol, and was bonded with all her mysteries, a lodestone for powers undefined. Lund brought the crystal surface close to his eyes. He remembered the instruction in the cave. Touch it, claim it. Understanding came to him. The touch was not merely a physical act, neither was the claiming. He reached for the blade with his mind, and there was an answer. Masters called it the Song of the Blade, unique to each one, revealing something of its potentials and affinities. Lund felt the movement in the chrysolite before he could see it. There was the communication of need, of requirement. The blade was composed to its full length, as simply as the closing of a hand. The edges caught the reddish glow of the fire, trapping the light inside, till it leaped from surface to surface, rebounding into blazing brilliance. All the eyes had turned to him, 300 polished coins of brass, and he knew then as never before that it was fear that had driven the Torque to hate them so. Vran were not slaves or servants. They shared the spark of divinity, and in their bodies pulsed the life beyond the limitations of mortality. Not a whisper moved among the crouching host. They could not tear their eyes away from the flaring light spilling over their champion. The blade seemed to be drawing all illumination towards it, to fuel the blue-white fire at its heart. Lund struggled to remain in control. It was painful to watch, the gathering of potential, like a gap between rational thoughts, yawning open in possibility. His grip on time was warped. Figures lined the ledge, the wild smell of them in his nostrils, a wall of beater warriors, staring, fiercely confident, eager to spill the blood of the weak. More crowded in, shouting, but uncertain. Around him the Vran boys stood in silence, the tips of their spears alive with the fire in his blade. The air was dry and cold about them. Still they waited, watching the firelight die. There were hundreds now facing them, no more room on the ledge. Horns sounded, and the mass charged forward in a wave of noisy violence. The smaller boys trembled at the end of their frail courage. Always they had been trampled on, broken down, beaten and brutalized. Only the shining champion stood between them and the savage fear that would have them cower and be crushed. Lund would not let the madness take him. If he lost control, there would be no one to signal the retreat, and the battle would rage until all the Vran were dead. He resisted the word that came to him, the battle songs, the calls for dreadful fire and scorching stone. Already the weight of his blade had doubled. He had to choose carefully not to be torn away from wakefulness. When the cruel wave was about to wash over them, he leaped forward, away from the waiting lines. They were not like the beaters he had known in the forest. These were men trained for fighting, and they would meet his blows with steel, or the hardened roundings of their shields. They would strike with swift power at his unprotected body. Axe and spear, sword and hooked pike were the snapping fangs of these wolves of the torque. A big man ahead of the rest lunged at him. Lun's long-anticipated blow fell, passing through the shield to sever the arm that held it. The whistling of his blade was a cry of release, of fulfillment, the opening of a great tale, at once startling and beautiful. He brought it back without thinking, and the tall warrior fell senseless. It was a dance of dreams, and the air danced with him. The stones of his hollow world gave him their heaving life, till Myro's heart leaped with fires unquenchable. He laughed with her at the ones who would stand against the order of things. Already a dozen lay dead around him. He was bleeding, he knew this, but there was no pain. They skirted round him, trying to move in from all sides at once. The madness all the time threatened to take him, but they feared the blazing weapon they did not know, and their fear made them clumsy. Wherever he moved, they gave way, calling for bowmen, locking their shields in a futile attempt to hold him back. Through them again, a splintering of shield and bone, the reek of seared flesh rising about him. Then the abyss. He was on the ledge. Move quickly, turn and strike. Every bow must be trained on him. His body was braced for the impact of their tearing missiles. Turn again, parry and strike. Down they went, again and again, to be trampled in the rush and press. Only the tall pikes would face him, striking from the sides, but the blade bit through the hardened wood, severing the heads of pikes and men alike. A warrior struck at his legs, touching his right thigh. This time he felt it, and the sudden pain sobered him. He was slipping into the wildness of battle, the red game of blind aggression. Behind him on the cavern wall, shadows loomed, dealing death in the low light of the embers. There was no line, no formation. The confusion of violent thrust and counter-thrust, the horrible screams of the wounded and dying, among them the cries of his brothers. He fought through the press towards them, his arm heavier now. The flowing vapors of Myrolus streamed forward, dragging at his legs. How long had it been? There was no way to tell. Would they even hear him above the din? How could they? He waded into the press to his right, and again they parted before his blows. A spear touched his elbow, another scraped a gash on his back. He skewered a warrior leaning over a prostrate drawn body, and freed his blade with his foot. His breath was coming quickly now. The warm blood trickled down his body. He pointed towards the exit with his blade, and shouted with all his might for them to get back. The warriors pressed forward again. They would overcome him with the sheer weight of their bodies. Lund had his back against the wall. The snapping, snarling wolves were closing in on him, but he was not restrained this time, nor was he helpless. The call came from his soul. In dire need, and in the vibration of his blade, he felt the response. He swung the weapon in a sweeping arc, scorching the air and stone, the armored men, the bodies of the fallen. The surface of the stone splintered away in small fragments, throwing blood from those over 10 yards away. The sharp crack robbed him of hearing for a few moments. Stunned figures dropped onto all fours, covering their ears. Lund leaned back against the wall. A heaving sigh escaped him. His heart was laboring in his chest. If there had been Vran unaware of the retreats being signaled, all were aware of it now. Stumbling, limping, they headed past him, before the warriors recovered and barred their way. As soon as he could trust his legs, Lund took a few quick steps forward. He lifted the blade as if to strike at the nearest knot of enemies. They shrank back, watching him carefully. Again shouts went up for archers. Slowly he backed away towards the drainage tunnel, making sure they all saw him. His 5 picked companions grouped about him, their spears at the ready. There were wounded Vran on the ground, but they would have to be left behind. The bowmen had arrived and were eagerly shunted forward by their fellows. Satisfied that the main body had already disappeared into the minor tunnel, he whispered to the others, and they broke into a run towards the single torch showing the way. At the sight of the fiendish slave taking to his heels, the warriors shouted and moved forward again in pursuit. An arrow or 3 touched the wall where the last group passed through the flickering light. The horn sounded the victory. The slave stand was over. the extermination could begin. Groth heard the signal and rubbed his hands together. He shoved bowmen out of his way and stepped onto one of the lowering platforms, shouting to the men on the ropes to lower away. He could not get down to the cavern quickly enough. His 2 eyes pierced the darkness of the abyss as easily as the dim light of the slave hideout. Not a single wretch would escape him, even if his men were blind down here. At first, all the casualties seemed to be theirs. He stalked angrily through the mess of dead and dying and grabbed a passing man by the arm.
Where are the captives? What is happening here?
The fellow seemed of reasonable intelligence.
The slaves split into 2 groups, my lord. The greater part has gone that way,
He indicated the tunnel to the feeding pits.
but the leader and a few others disappeared into that tunnel.
Now his hand swung round to the left to point out the drainage pit tunnel.
2 of the captains have taken men in pursuit.
Groth released the man and looked about him. There were a number of openings in the cavern wall. The warren would have to be extensive to have housed such a large number of slaves. Every tunnel would have to be explored to see where it led. His next thought was on the difficulties they might encounter in such an undertaking. Then he realized that his pursuing warriors might easily be ambushed by waiting bands of slaves. He beckoned 2 men over and sent them off to recall the pursuers. No rash actions would rob him of the victory won this day. Groth turned his attention to the battlefield. There was still movement here and there among the prostrate forms. His men quickly finished off the few slaves still moaning. He would have them collect the right ears for account. It was clear that the warriors had a difficult time telling friend from foe. Groth bellowed out his orders.
Archers! I want this entire cavern lit as if the sun had just risen in here. You cannot fight these demons in the dark.
Archers stood watching the various tunnels branching off the cavern. There would be no surprise counterattack. A captain brought a sturdy-looking spear up to him. He took it and looked it over. The tip was fashioned from a glassy substance he recognized immediately as chrysolite. He turned his shocked gaze on the captain. It was a completely unexpected development.
How in the name of Dark Lauren's hideous mother did they get a hold of this?
The man shrugged.
There are more than 20 of those scattered across the floor where they fell. I believe the whole lot was armed with these.
Groth flung the spear away into a corner. There were always more surprises with these wretched slaves. One could not rest until the last one of them had been accounted for.
But their leader used a sword of the same stuff. I've never seen anything like it.
He shook his head.
There was some enchantment.
Yes, it's what they call the art. The curse of all the tour. This man must be killed as soon as possible.
Lund turned back every time the group faced the difficult section. The beater warriors seemed slow in their pursuit, but he could hear their shouting not far to the rear. Of course they would be wary of ambush, and since they did not know the tunnel and its tricky places, they would have to proceed with care. Without rope, it would be even harder to keep up. He was glad of it. The response from his blade had done something to his body and mind. He had an overpowering need to sleep, and his hands were shaking as if he had strained the muscles in his forearms. A touch of sickness washed over him from time to time, as of a fever about to start. The rope waited for them where it was supposed to. Luren's anxious face looked down from the wide ledge of Kor's cave. Lund was glad to see him there. He had memories of the boy's healing touch. One by one they climbed up, holding onto the rope for support. Shouts echoed behind them now. The pursuers were closing in. At last, Lund took hold of the rope. He almost did not trust himself to negotiate the slippery side of the pit. His entire body was shaking now, to such a degree that he sheathed the blade for fear of dropping it. Silently, it contracted to the size in which he had found it. He twisted the rope round his waist. Only 20 feet of climbing would bring him to relative safety. Lund breathed deeply and placed his toes into the first groove. His body swung out over the crevasse. He was going to slip and fall. There was no strength in his grip. Dizziness swept over him. There were hands now, helping him, tying the rope round his waist. Voices whispered to him, and he felt the upward surge as they dragged him towards the ledge. Behind and below, angry shouts erupted. The last thing he could hear was the singing of the bowstrings. Lord Groth rolled the body of a dead warrior over with his foot. A powerful blow had cut into his left shoulder, through the leather armor, deep enough to reach his heart. It was the kind of blow he would be proud to deliver. So the slaves had some teeth, crystallite spears, and a warrior strong enough to strike single death blows. He looked over the battlefield. There were a great number of fallen bodies in the center and towards the ledge. Yet here not a single dead slave could be seen. Shields had been splintered and limbs hacked off cleanly. It was the work of a champion. Of course, he remembered, the notorious leader, of sufficient strength even to attract the attention of Horan, and of sufficient intelligence to organize the resistance in the forest during the royal hunt, as well as escape from the prison in the citadel, not to mention the whole fiasco that occurred in the feeding pits. A resourceful, dangerous adversary. But now he was trapped, with no more room for fancy tricks. His lease on luck had run out. He could imagine putting the head of this fine fellow on a pike and marching it all the way up to Nuria as a present for the great king. A man hurried up to him.
Lord Groth, you have to see this, sir.
He was led into another sizable cavern. A few belongings were scattered over the floor. A group of men was standing next to a smooth section of wall, holding their torches high. As he approached them, he could see they were gloating over something. The captain slapped his hand in what seemed to be an elaborate drawing.
The slaves have mapped out their tunnels here, sir, and forgotten to erase it.
He glanced over the drawings. A smile spread over his rough features. At last, the whorish luck had bestowed her favor on him. This little chart would be useful indeed. He laughed loudly with the rest, forgetting for the moment that the illiterate, language-bereft slaves had been able to draw such a detailed map, complete with markings and lettering in their obliterated ancient tongue. Strong patrols would be sent down each of the passages. If any resistance was encountered, the main force would follow, eradicating any slaves there. He would clean out the nest systematically. The pile of ears would grow tall, till only the very young and the very old were left. These he would simply cast down the chimney, instead of dragging them all the way back to the feeding pits. Lund was aware of shouting, excited and urgent. Torchlight flickered below them, mingling with the dim grayish tint of the pit. He was on the ledge, lying on his back. Figures moved about him, furtively peering over the side at the shouting below. He tried to sit up, but a hand restrained him. Urin's voice whispered in his ear.
Hold still. They can't reach us here.
He sank back into the darkness. The voices faded away. None of the Southland warriors had the nerve to climb the pit side without a rope, and even if they had one, there were spears waiting at the top to skewer the enemy foolish enough to show his face above the ledge. So they sent up a few arrows instead and settled down to watch the slaves. As far as they could see, there was no way out of the pit, except as they had come, or to climb the near vertical walls. A man was sent back to report and fetch supplies. 32 others remained, settling down for the wait. While Lund slept, Lurin had them turn him on his stomach. The gash had stopped bleeding now that he was no longer moving around. It was not deep or dangerous, and would wait till he had the right herbs for treatment. A few hours passed uneventfully. The 5 boys who had accompanied Lund sat about conversing in low tones. They had all witnessed the spectacle of their leader's charge and the impossible power of his blade. They had seen the enemy fall and scatter before him. Even when they were hard-pressed and beaten back, there were the thoughts of him and the lightning strokes of the weapon with which to resist the rising panic. At last he stirred, and they fell silent, staring. Lund glanced about him in the dark. The worst of his trembling weakness had subsided. He was ravenously hungry. Luren saw the look in his eye and shook his head.
There is nothing left here to eat, but as much water as you could desire.
He passed Lund a cracked cup brimful of clear liquid. The latter took it gratefully, moving his tongue over his dry lips. When he had gulped it down, he handed back the cup.
I could have 10 more of those, if you do not mind.
The boy nodded and backed away. When he returned, he had a cup in each hand. The second one he had brought was leaking, and Lund emptied it first.
Where do you get clean water? I thought all the water flowing through the drainage pit came from the sewer ducts.
Luren shrugged.
There are many trickles of water down here. The water you are drinking does not come from the pit. Kor said it comes from a long way off, from mountains in the east, pressed close to the surface here. There are
He struggled to think of a word.
elements in it you will not find in other water. That is partly why he stayed here, to be close to it.
Lund considered this.
One of these trickles lead to a way out.
The boy shook his head.
We are trapped here. I am the only one small enough to get out through the ducts.
Lund knew this to be so, for the drainage pit tunnels ended in the narrow ducts leading to the cells in the running and fighting pits. None of these would let a grown man through, but he knew of a duct wider than the others. He had helped shape it with his own hands not too long before. He spoke with growing excitement.
From here, yes. But we opened a new duct from the temple we built for them. It connects the outside with one of the main channels to the pit. I worked on that one myself, and made sure it would allow passage for someone my size. If you could give me the directions from where we are sitting, I will be sure to find where the channel opens into the pit. The incline is not steep. It would be no more than 50 feet below the surface.
That would be easy. The entrance to the draining pit from our cavern faces west. The main channel you are looking for will be up there to our right.
Luren pointed with a thin arm. Groth stared at the grisly trophies of the night's work. Only 27 slaves were accounted for. He had lost 81 dead and 17 badly wounded. Such losses had perhaps been necessary for the taking of the main cavern. Yet he had hoped to get in among the main body of the slaves, destroy large numbers of the ones who could not resist. That would have counted as a substantial victory. Now he had improved his position, but suffered many more casualties than his enemy. This was not encouraging for his men who had expected an easy win. It was their leader. He had given the brutes a mind and an unprecedented ability to resist. Formerly, it had only been the fighters among the slaves who had possessed any nerve. These were long dead, mostly destroyed during the near-successful uprising. It was unthinkable for a runner to make such a show against trained warriors. Yet it had been one of these insidious runners who had killed Rank in the hunting trails not too long before. Every hour messengers came back from the patrols exploring the tunnels. One such man came up to him now. He was out of breath and excited.
Sir, contact made with the party that pursued their leader.
Report.
The slaves are trapped where the tunnel ends at the drainage pit. There are 5 or 6 of them. Our men are keeping watch, but they can't reach where they are.
Is he among them?
Yes, sir. He seemed weakened or wounded. The others dragged him up with a rope.
Groth smiled. Here was an opportunity. If the leader could be taken, his task would be that much easier, and the casualties would certainly be much lower.
How many men are up there watching?
About 30, sir. There is little room for more. It is a tight place and the passage is quite narrow.
Groth nodded in satisfaction.
Tell the next man going out there to give them a message. I want that leader pinned down there at all costs. Have them put an arrow into anything that moves. If there is a counterattack, they must send back a man for aid immediately.
The man left in a hurry, and Groth walked up to the wall map. He traced the line of what he believed to be the long, twisting tunnel ending in the drainage pit. Yes, there was some indication of a vertical shaft at the end of it. Why had the fellow fled here? Had it been an accident? He believed not. Every move up till now testified of careful planning, of a scheming, cunning mind. This one had also been carefully considered. But to what end? Was there an exit to the surface, or a connection with any of the other pits? Certainly the sewer ducts were too narrow for a man to pass through. He had enough men to watch all the exits. The slave leader would want to rejoin his band. There was still the matter of the exit the slaves had used for their raid. No doubt he planned to use the same passage to link up with the rest again. The silly boy had forgotten that he knew the pits as well as any slave. Better. As soon as he was spotted, they would simply follow to discover where the remainder was hiding. Luren handed the rope to Lund.
If you wait any longer, they might be able to see you from the ledge. The sun must be almost rising outside.
Thank you. I will secure it as soon as I have reached the right exit. Where will you get out?
The boy considered this carefully.
The running pits will not be watched, I think. I heard the dogs passing through there days ago.
Lund peered over the edge. The warriors below were seated or lying down, their eyes fixed on the dark hollow above the ledge. Bows were held at the ready with arrows fixed. He glanced up at the sides of the pit. There was a constant dripping of water from the inlets of the sewer ducts. The rains had come. The western face seemed drier than the rest of the wall. Luren touched his elbow and whispered in his ear.
There are loose stones here. The bowmen won't be far away from me. I could spoil their aim at least.
Lund smiled at the boy.
You could, but don't linger here too long. You will have to make your way to the temple by yourself. We cannot wait there. If you are too late, make your way down to the feeding pits, through the lowest level among the cages to the back. There is an entrance hidden.
He placed a foot on the ledge, looking for cracks and rough places for his fingers and toes. His sandals and blade dangled from his girdle. The rope had been secured round his waist and passed into the hands of his 5 companions. He knew they would hold him if he fell. Faint light streamed through the ducts into the pit, like windows in the mist. The stone was cold beneath his fingers. Lund took a deep breath and started upwards. The opening he was aiming for seemed further than it was. The distance could not be over 40 feet, allowing for the 10 feet or so he had to move sideways. The trembling had returned to his limbs, and he was a little light-headed. From far below, the sound of the water splashing on rock reached up to him. He shifted his weight to his right foot and reached up with his left hand. The hollow he found with his fingers seemed deep enough for a hold. Now the toes of his left foot quested over the slippery rock. They found a tiny crack. Would it support his weight? He could not linger on the face. His strength would give out. A full day would pass before he could make another attempt. Lund moved upwards, feeling the weight come onto his left leg. The hold was not a good one. He needed a place for his right foot. His arms were both trembling now. There was a bulge of rock beneath his stomach, forcing him away from the face. For a moment he was convinced he would fall, but the fingers of his right hand secured a good grip and held him for a few breathtaking moments. By the time he had brought a knee over the bulge, he was breathing heavily. A challenge sounded from below. Perhaps they had heard something, or had seen a flicker of movement in the mist. He knew that the warriors could not have an accurate idea of where he was, yet it served to increase his anxiety. He kept still for a few moments, waiting. An arrow whistled past him from the dark, touching the side of the pit with a clicking sound somewhere to his right. They were shooting blindly, the light from their torches obscuring their vision. Yet without the torches they were as good as blind. He was grateful that there were no Torque archers among the warriors watching them. It was a bit of a mystery that all the Torque seemed to have disappeared from Grail, but this development gave the slaves a fighting chance. The opening loomed above him. There would be a moment when he passed through it that he would stand out against the dim light. With so many eyes now watching, he could expect an arrow or two in his direction. Carefully, he worked his way upwards. With each foot gained, his hopes increased. Just beneath the opening, he gathered his strength for a quick crossing over. Still, there was a shout and a flurry of arrows when he made the move. He lay panting on his back for a while, grateful that the climb was behind him. Lund could feel a definite movement in the air. He looked about him for a place to secure the rope. If he had brought a spear, it would have been an easier task. In the end, there was little but the angled corner of the duct with which to take the strain off the rope. He secured his feet as best he could and tugged the rope 3 times as a signal that he was ready. The next climber would be on his way. Once the boy named Leogarth joined him at the top, he was no longer concerned. They wedged the boy's spear into a corner and tied the rope to it. With 2 pairs of hands to hold it, there was much more security for the climber below. Arrows had again tapped the rock wall and fallen away into the depths of the pit. The warriors below could make out the activity near this window, and were ready for any movement. Certainly they must realize that the slaves were making an attempt to escape. Would they be content to watch them go? Would there not be men waiting outside to challenge them as soon as they emerged? But then the door commander could not be certain of any particular place where the slaves might appear. He would have to spread out his watchers, and he could not have too many to spare if he meant to search the tunnels at the same time. After the trouble they went to in order to secure the lower cavern, Lund did not believe they would leave it lightly defended. The men had all joined him, each with his accompanying volley of missiles. He had warned the climbers before the last step, and, aided from above, they all managed to avoid being hit. The rope was reeled in and coiled. They set off up the passage at a crouching run. Every now and then a duct opening presented itself, but all were too narrow to allow them access. The one they were in grew smaller till they had to crawl. Not long after, a wider than usual duct appeared to the side. It was the right passage. Lund remembered the tedious hours spent here, chipping away at the brittle rock. The place was dry and airy, connected with the open-roofed temple. The grill at its end was loose, as they had left it several 10 days before. All was dark and quiet on the other side. Nothing moved in the temple interior. The basin mounds surrounding the central sacrificial altar looked like great hulking beasts. It was an immense relief to know that this place would never be in use. That altar in the middle had been meant for him, and the priest who performed the ritual would have been none other than the Lord of the Torque. But the Great One had been robbed of his prey. The basins would remain free of blood, the demon faces on the pillars an empty threat. They slipped out over one of the walls. It was probable that the doorways would be watched. Already the sky was paling before sunrise. They would have to hurry. The streets of Grail were dead. The houses seemed deserted. The morning smells of wood smoke and baking still floated over from the barracks in the citadel, but there was no sound or movement among the dwellings of the beaters. The folks of the city had left without a good part of their belongings. The boy stayed with him as he moved through the shadows of the buildings. They skirted the arena and flitted towards the feeding pit's entrance like ghosts, their bare feet making no noise on the paved road. Lund had them halt behind the animal pens outside. He scouted ahead but could not discover whether lookouts had been posted here. In eerie silence, slipping from one deep shadow to the next, they entered the feeding pits. Lord Groth clambered over the rim of the chimney ledge into the great court. He frowned at the group assembled there as if they had transgressed in some way. Since the messenger had arrived from the watchers in the drainage pit, he was plagued by indecision. The slaves were making their move, but their intentions were still not clear. The leader knew that he had been spotted and would not escape the pit without detection. That was beyond doubt. But would he be so foolish as to lead them to the rest? Did he not merely plan this to lure away as many warriors as possible from the cavern to the court, while the others planned a counterattack? For the first time, his 1,000 men seemed too few. 200 had to remain in the city to guard the various gates and walls, as well as the citadel. With the amount of cunning displayed by the slaves so far, he could not dare leave the structures in the town undefended. He might find himself besieging the very citadel that was supposed to be his headquarters. The best part of another 100 had already become casualties in the fight. He dared not leave fewer than 400 in the main cavern down the chimney, since the number of armed slaves had been estimated at 200 at least. With more than 200 on patrol searching the tunnels, and almost 50 watching the drainage pit or manning the ropes here in the court, he was left with a paltry 40 men to trap the leader. Should he have brought more? What if that was his opponent's plan? It was a game of predator and prey, and he was not entirely sure that he was the predator anymore. The leader was weak. They had seen him fall. He had only 5 others with him. There would be no risk. Groth did not have long to wait. Footsteps hurried down from the entrance to the feeding pits. It was one of his lookouts. Here was certainly the tidings he had anticipated. The man halted in front of them.
Slaves, sir, entering the feeding pits.
The feeding pits? Either this was an elaborate trap, or the gods were smiling on him. There was no escape from the feeding pits. The wall torches flanking the guard rooms were lit. Lund and his companions hugged the wall passing through, as if this would aid them in entering the pits unnoticed. Yet they had hardly gained the darkness among the remnants of the first cages when a figure barred their way. Lund's hand had slipped to the hilt of his blade before he recognized the small frame of Luren. They breathed again, looking at him reproachfully. Lund was relieved to find him there ahead of them. The boy whispered to him urgently.
I saw you coming in. A man went past a moment ago, running towards the court.
Lund turned to the others.
Hurry, we've been discovered.
Away they sped, while Lund considered the significance of what Luren had seen. The man had gone to summon aid. It could be that the warriors of Grail were all down the chimney in the cavern, searching. But if lookouts had been posted, the Torque Lord expected him to return. Perhaps there remained enough men in the great court to trap him. Down the ramps they sprinted, round and round again into the darkness of the lowest level. Lund's feet were dragging. He had no strength to struggle against the Torque now. If only he could reach the safety of their hideout in time. Yet even if he could, and they were seen, the whereabouts of the slaves would be known. The gate to the Roning pit was shut. Would they have locked it? The fleeing slaves slammed into the bars, shaking them. A quick glance behind revealed no signs of pursuit as yet. Apart from the 3 heavy bolts, a length of chain had been used to secure the gate. A strong lock had been thrust through the links and closed. Frantically, he drew back the bolts. Perhaps there would be enough room for them to slip through. When the last one opened, they all pushed against the bars. The chain rattled and snapped tight. Sounds of running feet came down the ramp towards them. The gap was only 3 inches wide. No one would escape that way. Lights appeared round the corner. There were shouts now. They'd been spotted. Lund drew his blade. What to do? One of the boys had a rock, but he knew the lock would not be smashed that easily. In desperation, he inserted the tip of the weapon into the rounding of the lock. He tried to concentrate on the need, but the response came only as before. The chrysolite angles expanded smoothly, strained against the metal round it, and sliced through. He worked the broken lock out of the links. The metal was hot to the touch. They were through, but the warriors were too close behind. He reached for breath. There was an immediate response.
We are pursued in the Roning pit.
Groth seemed to be waiting for his request.
I have 30 spears on this side. Do you want them?
Lund glanced behind. There were about that number of enemy warriors closing in behind.
Yes, we need them.
The monsters stirred at the sight of the slaves dashing through their domain. Soon their screaming roars filled the place. They had not been fed for several days now, and were angry as well as half crazed with hunger. Hard pressed as they were, the slaves still quailed before the threat of these horrors. It was hard to believe that the cage bars would hold against the onslaught of the heavy claws and mighty fangs. As soon as more slaves appeared from the direction of the hideout, Lund ordered the fleeing 5 to face about. It was only just in time. Mere moments remained before the weapons clashed together, and the trained men swirled round their flanks like a flood. Groth watched with horror as the beater warriors closed about the knot of Ron. Surely they would be engulfed before he could reach the struggle. He shouted and his men answered. The warriors became aware of them for the first time and hesitated. The hesitation saved Lund and his fellows from being overrun. Still, one of the slaves had gone down before Groth and the reinforcements joined in. For a while things were evenly matched. Across the deathly arena they struggled, watched by the red slit eyes of the Ronings, their shouts and cries drowned in the din of the beasts. Lund kept himself in the middle of the fighting. His blade was composed and swift, even while his legs faltered under him. Once he almost fell while parrying a vicious blow. Groth moved in to strike at his assailant. Two hands gripped him from behind, and a voice shouted in his ear.
Hold still. Let me touch you.
It was Liren. He knew what the boy wanted to do, but there was no time. A large figure had appeared through the gate, towering over the rest. Lund recognized him as the chief overseer, remembering the moment in the arena before the Torque King, when this one had almost snapped his neck. Groth, he was called, a veteran of many cycles in Grail, a creature without a heart or a conscience. He bellowed above the din of battle.
Bring me their heads.
The massive Torque pointed with his sword straight at Lund.
Take him alive.
The slaves had a disadvantage of numbers, but they fought with a strength born of desperation. Yet their ferocity could not protect them from the expertly wielded weapons of their enemies. Lund watched them pressed backwards towards the hidden exit. He tried to step forward, but fell to his knees.
Wait!
Liren hissed behind him. He had not imagined the boy could be so forceful. Hands closed round the back of his neck. He realized immediately that this touch was a practiced contrivance, and perhaps the reason why Kor had lived long enough to see him face to face. He drew a sharp breath. For a brief moment his vision blurred, and the scene in front of him was tinted red. But the warmth that spread through his limbs was life and vigor, sufficient to have him stumble to his feet again. Even in this dead place, with its faded bones and blood-saturated soil, the blade sang with the blue sparkling force of a noonday sun. This time he gave himself to it. Brith could take command if things went ill for them. He was free, a broadwing born on the unseen breeze, with a breath of heaven in his being. Brightly blazed the anger of the blade, till it shone like a beacon in the dark nest of evil. Before he had struck down 5 enemies, they were shrinking back from him, afraid. Some of them had witnessed the spectacle but hours before in the cavern below. He went after them, a whirlwind, swift, irresistible. Some dropped their weapons and turned to flee for the gate. Groth barred the way, roaring out his rage. The warriors made a half circle in front of him. Lund smiled at the weakness creeping back into his limbs. Behind him the bronze stood staring. Only 20 of them remained on their feet, Brith among them. Quickly he urged them forward. The warriors charged, all their weapons pointed at one man now. The blade swept like a scythe, killing the front 5 instantly. Bronze spears closed in round him to protect his flanks. A vicious engagement followed, as the men grappled arm to arm and chest to heaving chest. Groth had thrown himself into the fray. He struck down 2 slaves with successive blows, wading through the struggling ranks as if through water. Lund beat off the attacks directed at him, and struck at those in front of him. It seemed he could not fill his lungs with sufficient air to keep breathing as he ought. He turned to find the brutal overseer, but it was not hate that burned in him now, yet something to strive for, to strike his blows for. The preservation of his people, of Brith exhausted and bleeding next to him, of the boy, Lyogarth, lying wounded somewhere on the roaning floor, of the thousands lurking behind a makeshift doorway in a gloomy cavern. When blades touched him, the pain was faint and far away. Only one enemy now lived in the violent space. The few still standing knew it. They ceased their struggles and fixed their eyes on the approaching pair. Groth wore a helm and thick armor. His sword was a foot longer than the standard size, and twice as heavy. In his left hand he carried a 2-handed axe he had snatched from one of the wounded warriors. His movements were deceptively quick for such a large figure. The first blow was a sweeping cut from the long sword. Lund went under the whistling fury and drove the blade straight at the man's chest. In the nick of time, the axe was raised to block it, but Groth stumbled back under the impact. He brought down his sword to cover the retreat. He bit into the hard soil where Lund had been. Back and forth they moved, trading blow for blow. Lund knew he had to make an end of it quickly, or his strength would fail utterly. When next he struck, it was with a different touch. When the axe came up to block his blow, it disintegrated entirely. Groth swore in surprise and pain. Blood trickled from his gloved fingers. Lund sensed the last of his energy had departed, like the wringing out of the last drops from a rag. He held the blade with both hands to keep it from shaking. His chest was heaving with the effort of drawing breath. He felt the urging of the blade, but he knew he had not the strength to respond. Groth circled him slowly, sword in hand. His breathing was also short now, coming in quick gasps. The slave leader had weakened. If he rushed in now with brutal strength, the victory would be his. He could claim the life of this greatest of threats for himself. Lord Groth launched himself forward. Around him the Ronin screamed, throwing their weight against the battered bars. The smell of spilled blood hung heavy in the air. The dead and dying lay silently among the bones. Lund watched the big frame come, the curl of armored muscle, the death glint in his eyes. He felt the shocking jolt as the first swing of the mighty sword struck his blade to glance off harmlessly. A quick half-turn and Groth was charging past behind him, but he would not allow him another attempt. The blade swung at the other's left leg, almost slicing right through. With a horrible cry, the big man fell into the dirt of the feeding pits. Lund went down with him, both hands on the hilt of the blade, driving it through the chest armor and into the space where the heart ought to have been. The vicious eyes glazed. The large body lay still. Grail no longer had a lord in command. A strangled cry sounded behind him. It was Brith's voice, raised in alarm. Too late he noticed the spear, flung from 10 feet away by one of the 3 remaining warriors. There was no time to move out of the way of the murderous point. There was no opportunity even to realize that this was his death blow. He felt the impact, as of a hammer striking home. There was a flash of blue, brilliant and serene. In wonder he saw a single letter, in amber etching, appear near the hilt of his blade. He was flung forward by the blow, over the body of his dead enemy. Behind him the spear clattered to the ground. Lund rolled over slowly. He was not dead. The weapon had not even pierced his back. Around his neck, the amulet blazed in blue fire, encasing the upper torso in a shell of composed chrysolite. The amber symbol on his blade had not faded. Brith was next to him, his eyes filled with wonder, the blood of the murderer red on his spear. He held out a hand to the prostrate form. Lund smiled weakly at him.
You repay your debts.
Glad I could, but you do not seem to need my paltry aid.
Lund was swaying on his feet. Brith held out a hand to steady him, but he shook it off.
There is still something we must do before we can call this a victory. Bring out another 100 men and have them take up the weapons here.
What do you plan to do?
We need to take back control over the Great Court. If we sever the ropes and cast their ladders down the chimney, the Torque host is trapped underground like we were.
Brith shook his head, smiling.
Leave that to me. You get yourself inside. If you can still walk that far, I will send Serdwin out to bring in the wounded.
He wanted to argue, to take the lead and finish the task, but the borrowed vitality had ebbed entirely. He sat down in the middle of the Ronin pit, for once not perturbed by their display of fury. Not far away, Lurin sat upright, with his elbows round his knees, a twisted little smile round his lips. Lund slept soundly and long. He knew that friends surrounded him this time. There would be no retribution for killing a Torque master, no brutal beating, no victimizing. It was a taste of the peace he craved. When he woke, Ceridwen was still at his side with Lirin. She smiled at him, and he returned it, a simple action, like a tonic to a worn spirit and a tired body. He could smell the baking of bread. Brith came up to them and knelt down next to him. He had a bowl of steaming gruel, which he handed over as soon as Lund sat up. The latter grasped the bowl and the proffered spoon. The smile never left his face. He nodded his thanks to Brith.
I would have some of whatever you are baking out there when I'm finished with this.
Brith inclined his head in mock obeisance. He was also acquiring the habit of smiling.
Anything for our champion.
Ceridwen touched his shoulder.
You are not in pain?
Lund felt the amulet round his neck.
Thanks to you, I'm still alive. There's nothing now but a little discomfort. I feel as good as can be.
He turned to Lirin.
I know who's responsible for that.
A shy smile brightened the boy's face. Ceridwen spoke again, frowning.
The boy Rin needs you. I reassured him, but they are in a difficult position in that cave you sent them to. You will have to speak to him as soon as you can.
While he waited for his meal to cool, Lund turned his mind towards the boy. The thought of Rin always drew pity from him. He remembered vividly the vicious cut from that pig Moshta's whip across the boy's back as the guard's foot pressed him down to the stone floor, the sobbing plea for help that was his first contact, and the hopeless horror in the child's eyes when he was tying his friend to the frame in the slaughtering shed. The touch was clear, if hesitant. Rin remained fearful, uncertain, like the small antelope of the forest.
We are trapped here. We blocked the tunnel again, but we have no food or water. When will you come?
Lund felt his fear, augmented now that he had to cower in the ghost cave itself. There was little he could say to comfort the boys. They were cut off. It had been a mistake to send them there.
How many of you are there?
It is only Brennick and me and 3 more. The others helped close the tunnel from the cave side and left. We have all the jewels here, but it is too much to carry.
The boy was intelligent, Lund knew. It would not do to lie to him.
You will have to be brave now, Rin. Tell Brennick to hold out for another day. The beaters are all over the caverns and tunnels, but we have killed their leader and cut them off from the Great Court. They also have no food. Keep up your courage. We will soon get you out.
Rin believed him. Lund felt the touch of that stare he had received in the slaughtering shed. The boy knew what his promise was worth. Yet how long could they last without water? It was not possible to reach them now. It would be best to force the beater warriors, leaderless and starving, into surrender. But with such numbers of them underground, it might take many days before hunger compelled them to give up. Certainly, the boys would be in dire straits by then. Rin fixed despondent eyes on Brennick. He was trying to be as resolute and brave as this other boy, who had less than a cycle on him and whom he so greatly admired. Brennick had a blade already. He was fearless, and Lund trusted him with everything. Most of all, he seemed entirely at ease in this terrible place they were in. The cave made his flesh crawl. He noticed it in the other boys too, but not Brennick. It had something to do with the time he had lingered here when they had first brought Lund. The latter had said a peculiar thing when they had asked him about Brennick staying behind. The ghost man had gotten him, and he had gotten the ghost man and would come away with a gift and a message. While he related to Brennick what Lund had told him, he looked about the place again. There was no ghost now. Whatever Lund had meant had to be a secret. Still, a shiver ran up his spine to think there was really a ghost that lurked in this cavern. Brennick was practical in his response. Lund would have to find them. That was without question. They had to prepare for when he arrived. Since they had a whole day and little to do, it would be best to get some sleep. The hours would pass, they would forget their hunger and thirst, and not be tired when it was time to move again. The treasure had to be hidden away, in case it had to be left behind. If Lund was alone, they could certainly not take the lot away with them. They searched for a place where the goods could be stowed away out of sight. There was no place to dig. The floor was almost free of soil, with sandy patches here and there, less than an inch deep. In the end, they used a hollow with a substantial overhang close to the ground. There were many loose stones about to pile in front. It took them less than an hour to hide their treasures. It was encouraging to complete the task. They were not victims waiting to be dragged out of their hole. They were soldiers doing their part to gain the victory. Next, they sat about admiring Brennick's blade. He would not say much about it, though. There were many other blades that they had taken from the cave. It seemed impossibly generous of Lund to let the boy have one, when so many others, including Brith, had nothing. They plied him with questions, but to no avail. Now their thoughts drifted to food. They listed all the best things they had eaten or seen others eat. They speculated about the wagon loads of food always going north. They imagined having one of those loads with them in the cave. It all became too much. Brennick ordered them to stop. It was time to sleep. There was no comfortable place for lying down. Any relatively flat section would have to serve. They spread out all over the cave till each found his bed. None would admit it, but they would have preferred discomfort to stay closer together in this eerie location. Rin could not sleep. His stomach was empty. He was scared. They did not have their blanket. His tongue cleaved to his palate, and he could not get the thought of the dripping water out of his mind. Every now and then he shifted and brushed away small stones that were poking into his back. The flat slab he was lying on was a little apart from the others, but it was certainly the best place in the entire cave. He was tired, and his mind could only struggle so long against the silent onslaught of sleep. He dozed off in spite of himself. It was always the rinsing vat. He would feel the slow ache in his legs, the slimy hides beneath his trudging feet, the swirl of the cold water around his thighs, and always the fear, paralyzing and potent, that would not even have him glance round to find the position of the overseer. Constantly there was the threat of violence, the whistling of the whip, and the streak of pain over his bare back, the crack of the stock against his fingers if he touched the side of the vat. Yet over all of it loomed the specter of the slaughtering shed. With the cattle so close, and the bloody work done there, a smell of blood always hovered over the tanning yard. This smell had taken on the flesh and demonic character of Moshta, the overseer. Now the real horror would start. Slowly they were led back to the deserted shed, Kevik and him. It took all his feeble strength to move his tired legs, knowing where they were going and for what purpose. The frames were so clear to him, frames to stretch the hides of cattle, the rawhide fastenings, now to hold the helpless body of a child. Sobs would rise in him, till it was difficult to breathe, and his fingers were stupid and slow. The big man swore and cuffed him. He saw Kevik's chest quivering through tears of pain. This was usually where he would wake, with the sound of that panicked breathing in his ears, and the dread realization that there was no salvation for them. Now he would know it was only a dream, a memory of terror. Someone had come. He was alive still. But this time there seemed to be no escape from the dream. He was trapped with a murderer in that far place, and the fear that suffocated him. Someone still came, though he could not see him. It was a whisper in his ear.
Turn around and face him.
It was a touch that his soul had craved through all these long dark cycles. He woke to it, and his spirit did not tremble anymore. The dread flowed about him like a great wind, but something tangible and solid had settled in him. He was not alone. In the face of the torque, rage and madness congealed. His lips were drawn back in a snarl. He was foaming like a rabid dog. The bloodlust etched on his brow, his bulging eyes. But they were no longer fixed on his victims. Someone was at Rin's side. Lund. No, more than Lund. The shadow of tall wings fell over him, and he knew it was no longer a dream. When at last he found himself in the ghost cave again, Rin rolled over onto his stomach, almost toppling from the rocky lid on which he lay. His body trembled all over, his teeth rattling together. For a few moments he pressed his face against the cold stone. A terrific pain seemed to infuse his skull with colors and faded images all jumbled together. He got up onto all fours and crawled towards the others. They appeared to be sleeping, but when he touched Brennick's arm, the boy sat up immediately.
What is it?
Rin tried to speak, but his tongue was too slow to form the words. Brennick looked at him closely. The boy was trembling, though his skin was warm and sweaty to the touch. His mouth was open, but only a moaning sound came out. Something had happened. Brennick did not need to ask another question. He remembered all too well.
You have seen him.
Rin nodded.
Just sit still and wait. It will go away.
The boy leaned forward and pressed his forehead to the ground. Brennick patted him lightly on the back. He was bursting with curiosity.
Did you see a sword?
Rin replied in single deliberate words.
I saw one. But not mine. Not yours? Whose then? A great man.
Brennick considered this.
A Vron man? Yes.
It was a mystery. Lund already had a blade, and he was the only great man Brennick knew. It could not be another from among the slaves, or he would have seen the sword for himself by then.
You have seen him before? No, he is dead. But the sword is here.
Brennick took hold of the bent-over form and shook it a little.
Here? Where?
Rin rose up a little and pointed.
I slept on it. Under that flat stone.
There was no waiting for him to recover now. Brennick woke the others and dragged them over to the stone. The dirt was scraped away all round it. Yes, there was a seam where it had been placed over a cavity. Kevik and another boy had hand weapons of sorts. Brennick drew his blade from the scabbard behind his back. There would be no rest now until they moved the stone lid off whatever it was hiding. Since they had not the strength to move it with brute force, stones had to be rolled over to serve as fulcrums while their weapons did the levering. Inch by inch, the thick stone shifted, till at last it balanced on an edge and fell away with a thump. Immediately they heard the water. A streamlet passed about 20 feet below, making its way downhill over smooth stone. Large rocks and debris lay scattered over the ground of the hollow, into which they gazed. Many cycles of wear had torn the bottom out of the hiding place under the slab. Whatever had been in it now lay among the rocks and soil below. They scouted around for a way down, but the crumbling rock did not afford any safe route. Brennick had them take off all their girdles and tie them together. He was lowered down first, but had to jump the last 8 feet or so onto a muddy pile of debris. First he lapped up the water where it trickled over clean rock, and then looked about for an easier way down. It was a much simpler matter with someone to direct them from the bottom. The boys impatiently took turns at the clean spot. The water was cold and marvelous. Even their hunger pains seemed to fade. They poked about in the dirt for signs of the blade. Soon enough one of them cut his finger on the sharp edge. Brennick felt about with more care, until he had the smooth surface of the weapon between his fingers. He worked his way up to the hilt and gripped it tightly. The others drew back and watched him pull it from the mud. They gathered water in their cupped hands to clean it. Carefully, almost reverently, the Vron boys washed the blade, till it was free of grime and dust. Kevik was the only one among them who still had anything with which to cover his upper body. He did not think twice to offer up this prized possession. The blade was wrapped reverently in the rag and handed to him. Brennick spoke in grave tones.
You saw it. Now you have to take care of it.
Everyone stood about in silence. They all felt the significance of what had occurred. There was crawling space where the trickle disappeared into the wall of the hollow they were in. Once they had struggled through this, the sound of water was clear and loud, rushing over rock somewhere ahead. 20 yards further, they had to work around a rocky protrusion that barely left enough space for their thin bodies to squeeze through. On the other side of it, they could see daylight filtering through. A few more steps brought them into a larger hollow. This chamber was brightly lit through a 2-foot hole in the far side. Brennick shoved his arm into the water cascading outside it. One by one they splashed through the curtain of water and into a greenish pool. The tall dankwood ferns fringed a sizable stretch of water, low in a gully among outcrops of dark rock. Brennick, followed by the others, scrambled out the side and up towards the room. Through the trees they could see the sun they had last glimpsed more than 40 days before. It was a most welcome sight. Brennick found the highest point and peeped through the brush in all directions. He soon glimpsed the familiar structure, a wall of 12-foot timber, the outskirts of Grail. They were just below the western running trails outside the walls. There was a loud knock on Zabrin's door. It had to be the middle of the night, he realized. He was more than a little annoyed. Not that he was asleep, but to be so rudely disturbed at such an hour testified of a lack of respect. Groth was taking this lordship farce too far. It was one of the garrison commanders, an educated barbarian among his mostly savage countrymen. He seemed excited.
Sir, you are to command the warriors now. Lord Groth has fallen. He was slain by the slave leader in the feeding pits.
Zabrin raised his eyebrows and quickly hid the smile. So, the slave champion had triumphed. He could not say that he was sorry about it. Groth had had few uses. One of them had definitely not been the lordship of Grail.
Thank you, Captain. I would have a full report on the current situation.
At last there would be opportunity to accomplish what he had come here for in the first place. He was to be the destroyer after all. The slave's nightmares were about to come true.